reason, the sort of conservative politics that I was always the most attracted to was the one that had a message like, hey, isn't it awesome that you get to live in this wonderful, rich, free society? You should be grateful for this and fight for the preservation of the social order that gives you and all of your friends and relations all of these great things. And you should do what you can to ensure that everyone else has access to all of these great things as well. Specifically, this means stick up for our capitalist economic system because it provides our wealth and prosperity, support stable traditional families because they provide our lives with structure and meaning, be grateful for authority figures like the police and military because they keep us safe, respect our democratic political system because it gives us the freedom to think and believe whatever we want, and be respectful of Christianity too because it gives our society its moral foundation. This is basically what I would call the traditional conservative worldview. The worldview of someone who sees the value in basically keeping things as they are. The worldview of someone who doesn't have much interest in challenging the status quo. A lot of people are not really conservative in this way anymore, however. A lot of the most famous and influential conservatives today are a lot younger and a lot more radical. They don't seem as motivated by gratitude and respect as much as a spirit of rebellion and a desire to stir up a lot of trouble. And why is this? It seems like a bit of a contradiction. Well, I think a lot of it has to do with what I was talking about before, which is this idea that a lot of politics is as rooted in personality as it is in ideas. These days, a lot of famous conservatives, particularly young famous conservatives, make a big deal of the fact that they used to be left-wingers.
Because you used to be a liberal.
Right.
And then you became a conservative.
That's correct.
Conservatives like to hear stories like this because, you know, a lot of folks treat politics like religion these days, and everyone likes to hear stories of conversion. But I think that having so many former left-wingers in the modern conservative movement has had a more dramatic consequence than some people realize. I mean, if you believe that people get their political views just from ideas, then it's really not that big a deal. Conservative ideas, I guess, are just better and more persuasive. But if you believe that a lot of people primarily get into politics because of their personality, then one consequence of this is that you're going to have a lot of people with the fundamental left-wing personality who are now embracing right-wing politics. And that seems to create a very novel and strange flavor of person. In contrast to your stereotypical person who likes things the way they are and is thus drawn to conservative politics, how would we generalize the stereotypical sort of person who is drawn to left-wing politics? To start, it would certainly be somebody who thinks that the way things are isn't that great and society needs a lot of fixing. They would also be generally distrustful of authority figures because, of course, authority figures would be complicit in enforcing the unjust society. They would be open to radical, dramatic solutions to fixing perceived problems. And they'd have no problem being seen as a rebel or somebody that's very controversial and disruptive. So you can probably see where I'm going with this. A lot of today's right-wing converts still have a lot of these stereotypically left-wing personality traits. They still view their society as like fundamentally bad and broken. They still think people with power don't deserve to be trusted. And they still want to have this glamorous image as like provocative rebels. The big difference is they've just swapped out left-wing answers for right-wing answers. Noted controversial guy Gavin McInnes actually has a pretty good video about this on YouTube. He starts out being this super punk rock guy and then at the end he morphs into a conservative. His thesis is that there's no real difference between being a rebel and being a conservative these days. Now again, how can this be possible? How is it that the rebel personality can so easily segue into right-wing politics? Well, this gets into one of the fundamental challenges of conservatism as a workable philosophy. It is actually very difficult to make a political philosophy that is just based around respecting the current way of doing things. For example, if I am a conservative in Canada, does that mean I should support the Canadian healthcare system just because it currently exists? A lot of people would say it is a socialist system, but because it is the system that currently exists, does that mean it is the correct conservative position to support it? By that logic, Republicans should support Obamacare too, because it currently exists. If you take this to its logical extreme, no conservative should ever support repealing any law ever, since the second any law is passed, it becomes part of the status quo. Or what about, say, if I lived in Cuba? Would supporting that country's communist dictatorship be the conservative thing to do, just because that's been their way of doing things for a long time now? Or what about the fundamentalist regime in Iran. It's a pretty conservative government by the standards of that country. So you could say that the conservative position is to support socialism in Canada, communism in Cuba, and fundamentalism in Iran, because all of those ideas represent the status quo. It is problems like this that led to the creation of a more universalist conservative philosophy in the mid to late 20th century, which was really more of what we in the Anglo-American world would call classical liberalism, or what they still call in a lot of other places just plain liberalism. Classical liberalism of this sort is basically just the ideology of freedom, particularly individual freedom as like the highest social good, mixed in with a love of free market capitalism as like the best economic system. So this more modern and narrow definition of conservatism basically says that the Anglo-American tradition of classical liberalism is the main thing we should be concerned about conserving. So a conservative of this sort would say that the Canadian healthcare system, or the Cuban dictatorship, or the Iranian theocracy are not in fact worth conserving because these things go against the values of classical liberalism. In those cases, the correct conservative position would actually be to favor radical change. And this, in short, is the reason why a lot of young people have found a way to be rebels and conservatives at the same time. These sorts of people would say, like, our society has become so corrupted with left-wing, anti-classical liberal ideas that we must really rebel and fight to preserve them. The authority figures that we would normally trust to preserve our classical liberal foundations are now warring against them, which means the whole world's kind of gone topsy-turvy. And in fairness, I do think there is a lot of truth to this. In a democratic society, a lot of different ideologies will be able to come to power, which means that the conservative position will sometimes be the oppositional, rebellious one. But let us not let personality completely off the hook either. The obvious question is to ask why exactly some people get so upset with the supposed left-wing undermining of classical liberal values. Is it just because they believe that personal liberty and free markets are the way to go? And that undermining those values with, say, more regulations on free speech or more government involvement in the economy is going to, screw up this nice civilization that we have? In many cases, the answer is yes, absolutely. You might not agree with that conclusion, but it's a political opinion. But I think it is also true that you do have a sizable number of self-proclaimed conservatives who defend the values of classical liberalism simply because it offers a convenient pretext for them to indulge in a rather ugly side of their personality, which is to say a desire to indulge in bigotries or biases against people different from themselves. This sort of thing has always been the dark side of modern conservative politics. Some of the values of classical liberalism that modern conservatives seek to preserve, chief among them freedom of speech and the right to discriminate, are in fact often used for rather nasty purposes by rather nasty people. And when you combine these political goals with this kind of very disrespectful, rebellious personality, you get a really ugly style of politics. And I would say that this is obviously one of the big problems of conservative politics right now. Anyway, I know I'm throwing out a lot of big ideas here. Political philosophy is obviously a very big topic, and it's actually quite a difficult topic to summarize because there's so many different dimensions to it. But I want to hear what you have to say. Why do you think people become conservatives? If you're a conservative yourself, why do you think you wound up that way? Particularly, I want you to talk about your political views as they relate to your personality, not just ideas. Anyway, I look forward to reading those comments, and I will see you all next week. Hey guys, just one other thing I wanted to say before we go. I now have a Twitch channel. I did my first ever Twitch live stream last week. It really went well. It was a lot of fun. Played some Mario and answered a bunch of your questions about politics in Canada and a whole bunch of other things. And I'm going to do another live stream this coming Wednesday, December 26th, Canadian Boxing Day. Going to start at 5 p.m. Pacific time. So if you're into Twitch, follow me using my username here, and I hope to see you there.